Seeing the Pattern by Aegis Shield, Chapter 1, Zecora. Pinkie Pie was finally managing to settle down for the day. Sugar Cube Corner had been closed, scrubbed down, and set to rest for the night. The ovens had been lovingly turned off and left to air out. The counters had been cleaned and all the perishables tucked away. Mr. and Mrs. Cake had gone upstairs to their apartment portion of the store. It was not unusual for ponies to live at their place of work, such as a library or a dress boutique. The Cakes were no different. Pinkie Pie, on the other hand, lived in the basement. She bounded down the stairs, 2 by 2, until she reached the bottom and closed the door behind her. "Woo! What a day!" she said, flicking her light on and rushing over to flop onto her bed. She went about her usual evening ritual of writing in her diary, brushing her mane, cleaning the barrel of her party cannon, and several other little tasks. She didn't want to wake the Cakes, so she didn't play any loud music or anything. It was late, after all, and with the new babies in the family, quiet time was certainly appreciated. Pinkie wasn't family by blood, but Mr. and Mrs. Cake loved her like another daughter, and she knew it. When Pinkie's mane was certifiably poofy enough, her cannon clean enough, and everything else where it needed to be at the end of the day, she finally pulled herself into bed. It got dark early during that time of year, but it just meant more time to rest after a busy, busy day of making confections. Having a great, content sigh, she flopped her head back onto her pillow, tucking herself in with a wide smile. She pulled the little chain on her lamp. Click. Darkness. It was 8:45 p.m. The clock read 10:17 p.m. when Pinkamena awoke. Her long mane hung like unpleasant, gummy seaweed, rising from Pinkie Pie's bed where her alter ego had fallen asleep. She frowned at herself in the mirror across the way. The scant hours of sleep would have to do for now. Luna knew Pinkie Pie consumed enough sugar to keep them both energized. Cocking her head to one side until a few bones in her neck popped, she tossed the comforter and rose, running a comb only briefly through her straightened mane. She set it down with a harsh click. Reaching over, behind the vanity mirror's drawers, she pressed a hidden button. Bzzz! Pinkie Pie's corkboard flipped over to reveal a map of the surrounding area, tacks connected by red thread in wild patterns. The posters on her wall seemed to peel down, showing candid pictures of every pony in town, known to Pinkie Pie and otherwise. Some of them had red scribbling around their faces, notes to be remembered. Bars rose up out of the floor to cover both the door and the small basement window near the ceiling. A small but messy desk popped out of a compartment hidden in the wall, positively buried with notes, papers, scribblings, and other knickknacks that told of complex and articulate work. The bed collapsed into itself and a long table emerged in its place, green like a pool table and just as covered with messy writings. Star charts and other astrological scrolls unfurled from their hidden spots in the ceiling, replacing Pinkie's hanging mobiles and party poppers. It was any conspiracy theorist's wet dream and more. Pinkamena snatched up Pinkie Pie's diary, flipping through that day's entry. It told of the usual things: eyeballing the nice stallion on the corner, friendship is magic, such and such, new pastry recipe, blah blah blah. Ah, there it was. Pinkie Pie had the very good habit of documenting whenever her pinky sense went off, and what had happened because of it. Pinkamena got a scroll of parchment, scribbling down the list of actions. Placing the diary back on the end table where she'd found it, she went to her workstation at the desk. Sweeping her long mane out of her eyes, she looked at herself in the mirror. While Pinkie slept, Pinkamena was in charge, and there was much to be done tonight. 2 new Pinkie Sense events had occurred in the past few days alone and would need deciphering. Using tacks, she pinpointed each location where a twitchy twitch or an itchy nose or a tingly hoof had happened. Finding her spool and thread, she used slow and careful motions to connect them with thin crimson lines. Stepping back a moment, she eyed the new pattern. "See the pattern," Pinkamena whispered to herself, trying to coax sense out of what she saw. "See the pattern," she mumbled in a sort of chant. Closing her eyes a moment, she heaved a deep sigh. This month there had been a 60% increase in the pinky sense. Some sort of event horizon was approaching. Something was about to happen. Something big. The map of Ponyville stared at her plainly, perfectly to scale, though it had been drawn by hoof to represent a radius big enough to find a pattern. Sure, the pinky sense would deliver little messages like watch for falling objects or beware of doors slamming open, but other times they would elicit more mysterious agendas. Pinkie Pie called them doozies. Pinkamena called them disasters yet to come. The angrily frowning mare stuffed a stale cracker in her mouth. It was nice to eat something that wouldn't give her diabetes for once. Salt awakened her tongue and made her senses more acute. Crunching noisily, she ingrained the threads and their crisscrossing nature in her mind as she went over to the long table. Unfurling a map of downtown Ponyville, she traced the past couple of doozies with a silent hoof. An old shop in Ponyville had collapsed on its owner, killing him instantly. The poor bastard's funeral was held on Hearts and Hooves Day. How cruel. Pinkamena squinted to the next doozy. The mysterious Dr. Hooves had lost his wings in a deadly flying accident, blown to the ground by a freak bolt of lightning. He was an earth pony now, by all definitions. Brushing her mane out of her eyes again, she kept searching. An Ursa Minor had been coaxed straight into the middle of town, thankfully quelled by Twilight Sparkle. Some disasters could be averted, it was clear. Pinkamena wanted to spot the next disaster and then prevent it entirely. Her nightly labors were meant to divine just such information. She reviewed all of the more recent Pinky Sense events. 1. Twitchy Twitch in front of Rose's flower shop while she was pondering the mysterious herbs. 2. Itchy Nose in front of the pharmacy while she was staring at new food colorings. 3. Tingly Hooves at a local bonfire party as soon as they'd lit the flames. 4. Elty in her thighs at Rarity's boutique after a rack of cloaks had fallen on her by accident. 5. Explosive belching while poised over soup before eating any at lunch. Pinkamena knew each of the corresponding mini-events with each of one of those, but all of them were meaningless. The herbs Twitchy Twitch meant some pony was pregnant. The pharmacy itch meant that Spike was peeking at something in the romance section of the library. The bonfire party Tingly Hooves predicted passionate love was about to blossom for some pony. The Melty Thighs cloak rack had predicted rain. The belching that some pony's cooking was about to go horribly wrong. None of those events had any correlation or connection, at least, not that Pinkamena could surmise. Growling softly, she traced a shape between each of the locations, trying to divine meaning. The lines, even when drawn in all different patterns, did not do much other than crisscross over the everfree forest. Pinkamena paced, still reviewing facts and dates and tidbits. Then it struck her. Going back, she rushed one of the first doozies. Big Macintosh, of the apple family, had nearly been crushed to death by one of his own apple trees. Though his ribcage and massive frame of muscle had saved him from death, he had been in wraps for weeks and weeks. Pinkamena looked at all the Pinky Sense events before that. 5 days, then 4, then 3, 2, 1. As a disaster drew closer, its warning signs grew closer together. Allowing herself a rather wretched smile, she rushed to compare time slots. Sure enough, there would be one sign, then 5 days, then another sign, then 4 days. It was a countdown to some form of accident or terrible event, usually with some hint as to the nature of the happening in the signs. Pinkie Pie had serious twitchy twitch whenever she passed Sweet Apple Acres for a bit, then burned any apple pie she tried to make for a bit, then farted explosively when Big Mac had gone by on the street one day. Signs were pointing to what was happening. Rushing back to the most recent set of events, Pinkamena studied them with renewed intensity. What was involved? A flower shop's herbs, a pharmacy with food coloring, a bonfire, a rack of cloaks, and a soup lunch. The gears in her head strained desperately. That was 5 signs. Wait, that was all 5 signs? Something bad was going to happen tonight! Gasping, she looked at the clock. 11 p.m. on the dot. It was like fate was laughing at her right then. Bizarre pinky sense or no, she knew it was true. "What does it all mean?" she whispered to herself, frowning angrily at the hints laid out before her. Herbs, coloring, fire, cloaks, and soup? Pinkamena scrubbed at her mane desperately, then rushed over to the posters where all the pictures of Ponyville's residents were. "Who is it pointing to? Which one of you?" She stared at each face in turn, trying to make the puzzle pieces fit. Gritting her teeth, she looked over at the clock. 11:10 p.m. At midnight, the time frame of the disaster would be over, and it would have already occurred. The only reason she knew it had not occurred yet was because Ponyville had not been buzzing about anyone's death or injury, and in a small town like that it was hard to miss. "See the pattern, Pinkamena Pie?" she roared, glaring at all the pictures, the crimson threads, and the information splayed everywhere around her. A long and angry silence followed. "It's right there! See it!" She flung the papers to one side, letting them flap hard through the air, rubbing her temples in a desperate attempt to fight off a headache. She swore to write a note to herself to get some migraine medicine from Zek. Pinkamena looked up. Herbs, potions, fire, soup on a fire, brewing soup on a fire. The pieces suddenly clicked into place, and in the back of her head there was an annoying tune. Pinkie Pie's tune. She's an evil enchantress, and she does evil dances. And when you look into her eyes, she will put you in trances. And what will she do? She'll mix up an evil brew, and then gobble you up in a big tasty stew. So watch out. Pinkie Pie's song. And the first time they met Sakura, she'd been under a hood and cloak. Gasping in hard realization, she rushed back to the map. Even in her crazy scrawling, she'd already confirmed it. All the lines from all the previous locations crisscrossed in the Everfree Forest. Sakura the zebra! Pinkamena grinned with a sadistic sort of glee. She'd figured it out, at last. Turning quickly to look at the clock, she gave a start. 11:20 p.m. Time was almost up, and for all she knew the disaster had already happened. Grabbing a saddlebag and throwing it on herself, Pinkamena sprinted, her pink seaweed mane flapping in the wind. Sakura was gasping quietly. She didn't know what had happened. She'd been mixing a lovely brew in her little hut, and then she'd... what? Perhaps added the wrong thing to her brew? It was unlike her to stay up so late, but her latest mix had needed full moonlight to stew properly, and her open window had helped usher in the beams. One wrong ingredient was all it took. The explosion had knocked her senseless, and it was all she could do to lay there and breathe. She was sprawled on her side, surrounded by steadily growing heat. Part of her mane had been singed right off, and she felt a warmth on the side of her face that told of a nasty burn. She was too stunned to move, and the hut was filling with smoke and fire faster than she could have imagined. That was the problem with living in a tree surrounded by wooden masks and potions with volatile ingredients. Very, very flammable. She tried to sidle towards the exit, but her legs would not obey. It was like a horrible nightmare where one's legs became lame while a monster chased you around dark hallways. But this was real, and the flames were growing closer. Sakura whimpered, mumbling nonsense and prayers in her native tongue as she waited for the extremely painful death to claim her. Tears slid from her eyes as black smoke began to find her down on the floor, and she coughed, trying to curl up and stay the inevitable. Suddenly, her door was bucked off its hinges, flinging itself across the room and onto Sakura's burning bed. A straight-maned figure coughed heavily, pushing herself into the burning hut and over to the nearly unconscious zebra. Hacking and swearing, Pinkamena lowered herself to inspect the damage. Ah, she was still alive. Pushing her head rudely under Sakura's side, she hefted her onto her back. The zebra moaned, incoherent from the smoke and pain. Pinkamena quickly exited the burning hut, depositing Sakura in the safety of a group of large ferns. Leaning over her, The pink mare angrily worked the zebra's chest with pressure patterns. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Ah! There! She was coughing more heartily. Her lungs would clear themselves. She would live. Pinkamena turned towards the burning hut with an angry, determined glare. "Saw you coming, I'm afraid." Turning quickly, she pulled Pinkie Pie's party cannon from her saddlebags. It was a loud, annoying thing, but it would do the trick. She never left home without it, after all. Leaning, Pinkamena fired. Splat! A pie shot into a window and onto a burning table, the messy innards extinguishing a few flames. She fired again, and a concentrated cloud of confetti melted like cheap plastic over another gathering of flames. She fired again, and the force of 100 kazoos is enough to shudder the hut to collapse on itself. Flames and black smoke curling towards the sky. She fired again, and again, and again. Ridiculous party elements that would do her bidding and soon put the flames out somehow or another. Pinkamena didn't question the party cannon, or how it was loaded, or how it always seemed to know what it needed to shoot. She only knew it worked, and that her alter ego Pinkie Pie maintained it. Panting and sweating in exhaustion, the pink mare leaned on the party cannon and studied the scene. Disaster averted. Sighing in genuine relief, she returned to the disaster's victim, Zecora. She was a hard-edged and angry pony, but she allowed herself a small smile at a job well done. Her alter ego Pinkie Pie would be pleased in the morn, no doubt. Zecora lay there, breathing quietly, stained with soot and with a mild burn on her muzzle. Her eyes fluttered a little, and she squinted up at her savior. "Who is this, with the long straight mane? Who saved me from the hungry flame?" Even as beaten as she was, she still spoke in couplets. Pinkamena scoffed mentally, but could not bring herself to be angry. Before Zecora's eyes could truly focus, the pink mare put a heavy and insistent hoof over her eyes. "What?" Zecora protested, but was too weak to actually shove the hoof away. Pinkamena didn't want to be seen. The last thing she needed was some pony, or some zebra, knowing she was more than one mare in one body. When Zecora went slack with exhaustion, Pinkamena snatched up the party cannon and was away. Returning to Ponyville, she skulked through the darker alleys as she made her way back to Sugar Cube Corner. There were other disasters to avert, other ponies to keep alive, other patterns to see. Replacing the party cannon in its normal resting place, Pinkamena collapsed into bed after she'd restored Pinkie Pie's room to its normal state with the push of a button. When the morning came, she would be Pinkie Pie again. Her more innocent persona was not aware of her nighttime wanderings, but Pinkamena would always be there, trying to read the patterns. The clock read 3 a.m. Pinkie Pie would wake the next morning, wondering why the party cannon was pointing in the opposite way she'd left it, and why she had traces of soot on her coat. Oh well, time to make cupcakes. Pinkamena slept within her. Chapter 2, Lickety-split. Pinkie Pie bounced along the lane, her saddlebags full of fresh supplies for that week's work. Carrot cakes had become all the rage lately, and they'd been getting plenty of requests for more. Carrot cakes and banana bread. Though neither were particularly healthy, they did have a healthy food in their names, so who knew? The bubblegum-colored baker was there to supply what the sweet-toothed public wanted. Chuckling, she stopped at one last stall to get a hoofful of carrots and winked playfully at the shopkeeper before turning to go on. She turned, bending her knees to keep bouncing along through the market, and ended up launching herself straight into Lickety-split. Oomph! The stallion fell with a grunt, several bunches of bananas falling out of his saddlebags and mixing with her carrots and bananas. His eyes were in swirls for a moment, until he shook his head. "Oh, sorry about that. I must have not been watching where I was going." He leaned to help Pinkie Pie up, but she'd already launched herself to her feet with a charming giggle. "It's okay, Lickety," she said, her cheeks a little darker shade of pink. I was bouncing along and didn't even watch where I was going, which I totally should have been since I need to get back to Sugar Cube Corner and make some totally... While her run-on sentence went way past the capacity of any normal pony's lungs, her eyes were wandering down Lickety-Split's handsome back to study his flank. The cutie mark there was a banana split with a cherry on top, telling of his great work at the ice cream parlor. Sure, it was one street over from Sugar Cube Corner, but it didn't make him any less handsome. Though the bouncing pink pony would never voice it, she certainly didn't mind eyeballing the stallion on the street now and then. The wild and rather heat-inducing ambition of ice cream cake boiled up inside Pinkie Pie until she felt something tickling her nose. She blinked and found Lickety-Split tickling her nose with the green parts of her own carrots. "You okay, Pinkie?" he asked good-naturedly. "You sort of trailed off there. Do you need help getting back?" He scratched his mint-green mane a little bit, smiling politely. Any pony passerby could cut the rather blatant tension with a rusty ice cream spoon. Nope, I'm okay," said Pinkie Pie quickly, checking herself over for bruises and then getting everything back into her saddlebags. Lickety-Split leaned past her head to put her carrots into, and she caught the quick scent of chilled vanilla off of him. Her tail suddenly exploded into a frizzy shape, and she was launched into the air by a nervous reaction. "Are you sure? Are you sure you're okay?" Lickety asked rather worriedly. Pinkie nodded, trying to calm her tail. "That was the Pinkie sense," she announced to him with a gabbing smile. "That frizziness explosion means to watch out for falling ice." Like any other pony in Ponyville, Lickety-Split acknowledged the power of the Pinkie sense, although its seemingly random implications meant little until something actually happened. He knew better than to question. "Is it gonna hail later?" he asked, cocking his head skyward. Midsummer didn't seem the time for such a thing. "Nope, just that something is gonna fall from somewhere," she said, turning to skip away down the street. Lickety-Split sighed and shook his head as she bounced away. An older mare smacked the back of his head when he saw him nodding up and down to watch Pinkie's backside go up and down. He smiled apologetically, but then went about his business. It would be hours later when he cursed himself in the freezer of his own ice cream parlor, having buried himself in an avalanche of ice cream buckets and shaved ice on accident. The Pinkie sense was never wrong. Only his hoof stuck out, and he was unmoving. It was 10 p.m. Pinkamina's eyes snapped open with a certain ferocity. Pinkie Pie had gone to bed early that day, so she felt slightly better than normal. Still grouchy and teeth grittingly annoyed for no real reason, but better than normal. Pushing her hanging mane behind her ear, she studied Pinkie's diary. Another Pinkie sense event had occurred, this time upon scenting Lickety-Split's mane. Pinkamena frowned severely, flipping the diary back a few pages and cocking her eyebrow. There was a scrawling of some stick ponies here and there, perhaps. Oh yes, there he was. She knew she'd seen the name before. Lickety-Split was the stallion Pinkie Pie eyeballed on the street sometimes. She'd even drawn a little picture of his cutie mark in her diary. A banana split with a cherry on top. Pinkamena rolled her eyes. Stallions were few enough as it was in Equestria. Surely he could have picked something more masculine to... what did it matter? She groaned at the little scrawling at the bottom of the page. Pinkie's pie plus Lickety-Split's equals ice cream cake? Pinkamena swore if she ever awoke in the middle of the night with that stallion atop her, she'd kick his ass right out through the tiny basement window. Snarling and flipping back to the more recent diary entry, she studied the happenings. The scent of vanilla had sprung the Pinkie sense to warn of falling ice. Narrowing her eyes, Pinkamena went to the vanity mirror, found the hidden button and pressed it. Bzzz! The corkboard on the wall shifted, the bed replaced by a long table, the desk extended, and her posters flipped for photos. Everything slid into place until finally her workshop was ready for another night of the Pinkie sense pondering. Scrawling the new event onto a scroll, she frowned dangerously. 5 events had happened. Tonight, another disaster would strike. Sighing and hating to do such things at the last minute, She took a brush to her mane as she went over the facts she had in her head. 1. Violently crossing eyes in front of the Ponyville china shop, staring at glass snowflakes. 2. Itchy butt at the small produce section of the market, cherries, berries, and small fruits. 3. Tingly snout next to a humming air conditioner at town hall. 4. Sudden 7 sneezes at the library while staring at a book on the shelf about small businesses. 5. Explosive frizziness after melting vanilla with Lickety-split, the stallion at the market. Pinkamena sighed. Some of the signs were so similar. Itching a certain spot of the body didn't seem to hold any context beyond the moment it happened. Last time it had been itchy nose. Growling and scratching out some of her cryptology notes from the last few nights, she returned to her chaos theory. Though Pinkie Pie seemed to have some sort of omniscient knowledge of the smaller events of the Pinky Sense, only Pinkamena could see the bigger picture. So, they both had opposite problems. Pinkie couldn't see the forest for the trees, and Pinkamena couldn't see what kind of trees were in the forest, or something. She growled again, looking up locations. The 5 new Pinky Sense events were all over the place, and didn't make a crisscross for a location this time around. It couldn't be that easy twice. She sighed inwardly. Using the crimson thread, she connected the 5 locations and stared at them. Perhaps they created some sort of dragnet? That the disaster would happen inside the perimeter of the 5 forecasting events? It was a thought. Squinting, Pinkamena crunched on a cracker. She finally thought to hide a box of them under the nightstand where Pinkie kept her diary. The pink mare never looked there, so it was a good spot. Salt was nicer than sugar anyway. There had to be some sort of pattern. Training her eyes on the locations, she squinted and slowly went through all of them again, and again. 11:07 p.m. She didn't have long. Locations and sometimes objects helped. Glass snowflakes, small fruits, air conditioner, small business book, vanilla scent, or was the trigger Lickety-split himself? And the scent memorable? She didn't know. Pinkamena paced, deep in thought. 11:15 p.m. Working her mind feverishly and rushing the brush through her long mane over and over to give her hooves something to do, she stopped. Wait! The Pinky Sense was never activated by a pony before. Not so explicitly, smell or otherwise. The dull pink mare rushed over to her map, glaring for... Yes! Lickety-split's ice cream parlor was within the perimeter of the other 5 events. It was a small business, with fruit flavors, with a powerful air conditioner to keep the treats cold. Snowflakes were a possibility, with a freezer that powerful. And Lickety-split, or was it the vanilla scent? She couldn't decide what the 5th sign was. She glanced at the clock. 11:17. It was a shaky theory at best, but she didn't have time to dink around and try to come up with something else. Going with her gut, she grabbed her saddlebags and rushed out into the night. Lickety-split lay barely conscious in the freezer, buried beneath hundreds of pounds of frozen treats and shaved ice. If ever there were an ironic death situation, this had to be it. Killed by his own product. He'd lost feeling in his legs, nose, and ears long ago. Was he going to get frostbite? He didn't know. He wasn't strong enough to move the pounds and pounds of delicious ice cream buckets, the hill of shaved ice, and the blocks of snowy treats. He was literally pinned, crushed beneath the very products he used to bring joy to others. He sighed, shivering and whimpering quietly. Why hadn't anyone come looking? His store was still open, and none had come looking. What if they'd made off with what ice cream he had in the display that was hundreds of lost bits? Then again, what time was it? He didn't know. His mind was, just slowing down. He was so very sleepy. But if he fell asleep, he might not wake up again. But he didn't feel as cold as he did before. He just wanted to... Just a short nap, he decided. His eyes started to slide closed. His breath a quiet, foggy huff from his nostrils. The door of the freezer burst open and Pinkamena shuddered inside. I thought so. she said, using her shoulder and shoving a good deal of the weight off the fallen stallion. Snorting steam and grunting with effort, she shuddered as she mare-handled the shaved ice mounds off of him. Using her hooves, she dug him out as best as she could. He had shifted from his normal off-white to a rather sickly shivering gray. His eyes were closed. Was she too late? Gasping, she thrust her ear down upon him. His heart was still beating. Turning, she kicked the freezer door open and dragged him out with all her strength. Despite being a simple ice cream parlor owner, he was actually quite well built and heavy. She didn't have the strength to drag him to the hospital, nor did she want to be discovered doing what she was doing. Pinkamena wouldn't be able to explain to any pony how she knew to go look for Lickety-split in his own freezer in the dead of night. Though the pinky sense was openly acknowledged, divining disasters with it would be something else entirely. No pony could see the future. Well, almost no pony, Pinkamena thought as she grinned wryly. Her brow lowered into a frowny, growling expression, and she stared at the limp stallion. What could she possibly do with him? This was not like Sakura. He would not thaw on his own accord. Sighing, she studied the ice cream parlor. Most ponies lived at their place of work, so... there! There was a door leading into a back room. Pinkamena discovered a sitting room, a tiny personal kitchen, bathroom, and so on. She dragged him inside, then came back to the front of the parlor to hit the lights, lock the doors, and pull the shutters. No witnesses to this madness. Lickety-split lay sprawled out on the cold, wooden floor, shivering violently and unconscious. Though his body worked hard to keep him alive and warm, at least in his chest area, the rest would sacrifice itself to aid the vital organs. Pinkamena was not a nurse, but she knew how dangerous hypothermia and other cold-related injuries were. She peered about, then saw he had a fireplace. Thick smoke from a chimney in the dead of summer would draw attention. No doubt his winter blankets and such were tucked away in some obscure corner of his attic. She saw a clock on the wall, 11:50 p.m. He would die before midnight if she did nothing. Sighing, she gritted her teeth and gulped a little. She'd set out to prevent a death or disaster, and it wasn't finished yet. Pulling the limp stallion up onto his own couch, she pulled the quilt that was on the couch's back up and around herself like a shawl. Then she laid on him. His fur and body were chilled and she shuddered, trying not to look at him. She shivered and stared out the window for a long time, then at the artwork on his walls. Then she counted the tiles in the ceiling and wondered why his ceiling fan had 3 blades instead of 5. Then, the scent of vanilla wafted up into her muzzle. She looked down at him with a furrowed brow. He really did smell like vanilla. What a feminine scent for a stallion to have. She found herself rubbing at the base of his mane, hoping to help the circulation or something. Color was slowly returning to his cheeks. The presence of another warm body was certainly helping a lot. In some dark corner of Pinkamena's mind, she understood why Pinkie Pie found this stallion so attractive. She didn't care for him personally, but he was not exactly ugly or anything. He didn't stink of sweat like Big Macintosh, or seemingly disappear at random like Dr. Hooves. He seemed normal and honest enough. He gave a quiet moan, and Pinkamena pressed him down again so he wouldn't wiggle under her. Sighing grumpily, she returned her gaze to the clock after a time. 12:13. She let out a long and relieved sigh. Disaster averted. Lickety-split stirred a little, groaning and his eyes fluttering. What was that sugary scent, that warmth pressed against him? Some pony laying on him? Who? Who? There was a flash of movement and his window was blown open from the inside by an unseen force. A black shape leapt out into the night. The stallion lay there, confused and mostly thawed from his icy tomb. The straight-maned Pinkamena pressed herself into an alley, watching Lickety-split come to the window and peer out eagerly. He didn't see her pressed into shadow. She held her breath until he closed the window again. Disaster averted. She returned to Sugar Cube Corner in a huff, locking her door behind her and restoring the room to Pinkie Pie's normal gay colors of celebration. Flopping down on the bed, exhausted, Pinkamena treated herself to another cracker. Brushing her mane behind her ears again, she allowed herself a small smile before sleep took her. The next morning, Pinkie Pie awoke having no idea why her fur had the distant smell of vanilla to it. Odd. Oh well. Time to make some carrot cakes and banana bread. This is Chapter 3 of Seeing the Pattern by Aegis Shield, titled Bon Bon. Pinkamena awoke in a puddle of her own drool. The later afternoon sun warmed her wonderfully where she sat on a stool by a counter. Anger flared up inside her and she slowly lifted her head, wiping her mouth. Pinkie Pie had gone to sleep in the middle of the day. Now their sleeping pattern would be thrown off. Snarling wordlessly, she peered around with sharp, hawkish eyes. Sugar Cube Corner's kitchen greeted her. There were 13 minutes left on the timer next to her, and all of their massive ovens were occupied. A brief check foretold the 10,000th batch of cupcakes and other confections. The thought of the tiny pastries turned Pinkamena's stomach, and she rolled her eyes. Snorting hot air from her muzzle, she snapped the last oven shut and moved to the next room. "Miss Cake?" she said with an even tone. The lack of enthusiasm drew a cautious response from the dumpy mare. "Yes, Pinkie?" Pinkamena put on a halfway pleasant face. I need to have the rest of the afternoon off. I'm sick?" No, she lived in the basement and she wanted to go out. Running errands? For whom, other than Sugar Cube Corner? Seeing some pony today," she said with a bucket of lying acid dribbled on top. Miss Cake stared at Pinkie. "You are?" The straight-maned mare looked so odd with her face and such an odd, contorted expression of effort. To be quite honest, she looked constipated. The elder mare cocked her head, and Pinkamena's half-smile slowly turned stony and darker. It was a mean face. Sure, Pinkie Pie. You've not asked for a personal day off in a long time. I'm sure we can do well without you for the afternoon." She smiled awkwardly. Pinkamena started for the door in a straight line, holding her nose up just a little. Her dull pink coat looked strange. When had she started fixing her mane that way? It looked like sickly seaweed, at the whim of gravity. Mr. Cake almost ran over Pinkie Pie when he came in the door with a stack of boxes on his back. "Whoop, sorry there, Pinkie," he said, scooting to try and make room for her, holding the door like a gentle colt. He frowned when she walked past him without saying a single word. "Huh, wonder if something's wrong," he said to her back. Pinkamena rounded on him with a black expression. Mr. Cake startled a little, and there was a dark silence between them. He gulped, lowering himself a little and walking backward into Sugar Cube Corner. When the door jingled shut behind him, he shuddered. "Must be her time of the month or something," he speculated, turning around just in time to run into his frowny-faced wife. He gulped again. Mr. Cake spent that night on the couch for his comment. Pinkamena wasn't used to the daytime anymore. There were many ponies going about their daily lives, paying her no heed. It was claustrophobic. She was used to having the streets mostly to herself. Casting her gaze around, she tried to make a plan. Maybe she should go running and exhaust Pinkie Pie, so she would sleep at the proper hours this night. Then the stutter in her schedule would be ironed out. "Hey, Pinkie!" Twilight Sparkle weighed down on both sides of her body with bulging saddlebags. "I'm headed to Zikora's place to help with her new hut decorations. Want to come with me?" She cocked her head, knowing the Pinkie Pie would instantly agree and insist on throwing a brand new house hooray party. The zebra's hut had been rebuilt over the past couple of weeks thanks to the love and support of half of Ponyville. They loved their strange, foreign friend very much and insisted on rebuilding her new place right where the old one was, with some fire safety equipment on hoof, of course. There was an awkward silence between the pink mare and the lavender one. "No," said Pinkamena in an even voice that made Twilight's ears turn back a little. The last thing Pinkamena needed to do was go back to the scene of one of her disaster aversions. If Sakura got even a short look at her mane like this, she might put two and two together. "Tell her I said hello, though." There was no love or joy in the sentence, similar to that of Rainbow Dash's reading a loud voice, strained and awkward. Well, okay then," Twilight said carefully, eyeing Pinkamena with a raised brow. With that, the purple unicorn turned and started down the street again, towards Sakura's. She'd be so delighted to get all the wonderful books she'd picked out. The library had multiple copies of some things, and she could donate them for Sakura's new home effort. Pinkamena jeered, watching her go. "Brainless lavender librarian." "Hey, Pinkie Pie!" Lickety-split had appeared behind her to her right. She jumped, choking on her own spit with dilated pupils. Hunching a little, she turned her head and glared murderously at him. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said, leaning back and lifting a hoof in case he needed to run very suddenly. "I just, His face turned a little pink, and he smiled awkwardly. She stared at him. "Saw you there and wanted to say hello." "Hello," said Pinkamena carefully, trying to ignore the waft of vanilla on the breeze. Stallions had no business smelling that good. Her straight mane flapped in the breeze a little. "I love what you've done with your mane." Lickety-split tried again, trying to smile but rapidly failing under Pinkamena's glare. "It looks like silky pink taffy," he complimented brightly. "I hate taffy," said Pinkamena frowningly before turning and cantering away. His face fell. "Ouch," said a mare from a picnic table nearby, smiling sympathetically. Lickety-split ignored her, trying not to think of the taffy-flavored ice cream sample in his saddlebag, the one he'd bought for Pinkie Pie. He'd made it himself, thinking of her. A little red in the face and defeated, he let his head hang. Sighing, he turned and walked away, kicking a little stone on the sidewalk. It was some time later before it occurred to him that Pinkie Pie worked in a bakery. Of course she wouldn't be eager for more sweets while out on a street, stupid. About an hour later, Pinkamena was at a restaurant, still thinking on what to do with the blasted day. She got several orders of fries, salted them down, and then put a big blob of ketchup on her plate. It was ironic because fries were made with salt. She'd put salt on them, and there was salt in the ketchup. Anything to get the eternal taste of sugar out of her mouth, even if only for a few minutes. She sat there chewing idly and staring at nothing with an unpleasant scowl on her face. The darker half of Pinkie Pie knew she didn't wake unless a disaster was near. But why had she awakened in the middle of the day? Yes, her other half had fallen asleep on the job, but not every nap or sleep cycle conjured her into consciousness. There had to be a reason. There was always a reason. A pattern to follow. She suddenly rolled her eyes. Well, of course, it meant that there was a disaster that was going to happen in the daytime. Not all disasters were so close to midnight like the last few. She allowed herself a rather dangerous smile, and a waiter that happened to be looking her way saw it and shuddered. Stuffing another hoofful of fries in her mouth, she rose, leaving her payment on the table and cantering away with renewed gusto. She passed by shops as she cantered forward, feeling a little better. She had purpose now. Pinkamena passed couches and quills, armchairs and kitchen knives, even boutique magnifique. She didn't really need anything, but it was ideal to scan the town for potential disasters. She couldn't go back to Sugar Cube Corner. She just left. All of her evidence couldn't be examined. The scent of vanilla distracted her while she tried to remember it all. There was a reaction when Pinkie had been finishing in a utensils drawer at Sugar Cube Corner. A knife, maybe? Then there was something at the candy shop. Pinkie Pie had stopped to get Sweetie Belle a little box of candies for acing a big test at school one day, after she'd struggled and studied so hard. Something about the candies. Pinkamena let out an exasperated groan, scrubbing at her mane in frustration. just as Rarity came around the corner and almost ran into her. "Oh, sorry, darling," she said with an apologetic smile. "It's okay," said Pinkamena dismissively. "I was just on my way to—" Rarity started to explain, but Pinkamena had already walked past her and around the corner. "Well then," she huffed, turning her nose up, "some pony's having a bad day." Pinkamena stepped into the alleyway, then behind some trash cans. A tall shadow followed her, and she pressed herself into the darkness. The scent of vanilla became stronger, and she pounced on none other than Lickety-split. "Why are you following me?" she demanded with a great scowl. "'Cause I like you," the stallion blurted, red-faced and trying to look determined. It was that half-angry, very embarrassed look that some stallions got when they'd been fed up with something and were nervously confronting their fear. Pinkamena knew such faces. After feeling sorry for himself for a bit, Lickety-split had figured that the best thing to do was to just out and confess, skip all the drama of beating around the bush. "I like you. Please date me." It was the most forced, forward, blunt thing Pinkamena had ever heard in her life. She stared at him for a long moment, trying to figure out if he was being serious. The hard-hearted pony threw her head back, and a cruel, resounding laugh that scared a few small animals out of the alley rang all around. She shoved him roughly away with a snort. "I don't think so." She cocked her head at him and scowled, recalling a line from a book Twilight Sparkle had once shown her, trying to impart romance novels upon the pink mare to get her into reading, too. Rainbow had been successful, why not Pinky? She recited from the book that had been pressed under her nose one day. "My heart falls asleep at the end of the day." There was a long silence, and the two of them stared at each other. A phantom breeze pressed her mane to one side, then gravity tugged it back down. "What?" Lickety-split said from where he was, propped oddly against the wall. "I'm not the dating sort," she said with an angry frown, stalking past him. "Stop following me, or I'll buck you into next Tuesday." Pinkamena promised pain. He winced, looking embarrassed and following after her. "I said—" "It's a dead-end alley," he defended quickly when she coiled up to hit him in the face. Lickety-split leaned backwards a little while she checked over his shoulder suspiciously. Wall. She glared at him with lidded eyes, her hoof snapped up, between his eyes and not quite touching his nose. She walked backwards, slowly out of the alley, her hoof held out in warning. Lickety-split did not move, only looked at her pathetically. She snorted, huffing her mane out of her eyes and then turning the corner to be away from him. He stood there, rejected and sad, confidence blown. Pinkamena started down the street, rolling her eyes, trying to get the scent of vanilla out of her nose. She stopped briefly in a scented candle store. She bought a candle that was supposed to smell like sea salt breeze. Sticking her nose into it, she whiffed a few times. Close enough, she decided. Paying for it, she came out with it in her saddlebags. The impulse buy made her feel a little better, and she stopped when she saw how dark the horizon was for midday. There was a nasty-looking storm coming. She could see the bare specks of weather pegasi flying furiously back and forth to coax the great thing along. "Hey, Pinkie Pie!" Rainbow Dash descended from high. "You better batten down the hatches. We've got a doozy set up for today. It's gonna be a huge windstorm to make up for the last two that got backlogged." The blue mare suddenly whinnied, rearing hard when Pinkamena's body exploded into spasmic twitches. Hey, are you having a seizure?" Rainbow Dash called, leaning over her. "Some pony, help!" Pinkamena's body convulsed powerfully, and she gave an audible whimper. "She's freaking out!" The pink mare's legs all bicycled helplessly, and then her attack stopped as suddenly as it had begun. She stood up at last, flustered and a little shaken. Ponies had gathered around, staring in concern. I'm fine," she said with a little more force than needed. It was just the pinky sense, she said after a slight hesitation. What's gonna happen, Pinky? Rainbow Dash said with big eyes. A lot of water, Pinkamena said quickly. The crowd deflated. Oh, Pinky, we know that. Sheesh. Rainbow Dash shook her head and once, sure her friend was okay, took to the skies. I'll see you later, she called over her shoulder, leaving a rainbow streak in the air behind herself. Pinkamena clutched her chest when the crowd had dissipated. A Pinky Sense event had happened to her? That had never happened before. She didn't know what to do. She had to write it down. No, she couldn't go back to Sugar Cube Corner until the afternoon was over. She tried to memorize instead. Her body had gone spastic when Rainbow had mentioned the storm, or when she'd seen it in the distance. Doozy, she mumbled, then her face lit up. Doozy! Rainbow Dash said doozy. The key word had invoked some reaction in the Pinky Sense and set Pinkamena off? It didn't make any sense. Pinkamena had never experienced the Pinky Sense for herself. She cocked her head and thought, why didn't she know what the twitching had meant? Pinkie Pie always knew exactly what each item was pertaining to. She thought hard. Nothing came to mind. She growled, stomping down the street. Pinky, are you okay? Lickety had reappeared, for he'd not gone far when he'd seen the whole thing. I'm sorry to bother you again, but that was kinda scary, he said. No, I'm not, she said over her shoulder at him, glaring a firestorm that made him lean back and lift a hoof defensively. The windstorm was starting. The signs hanging outside the shops flapped back and forth in the wind. And you need to stop following me, she exploded, pressing her face into his. He retreated backward, terrified of her wraths very suddenly. For a pony that was known to defy logic, mood, and even gravity, she was stubbornly angry and directed at him. It made him very squirmy. Who knew what she was capable of? Backing up and trying not to rear or whinny in fear, Lickety-split retreated. Didn't I tell you plainly enough? She roared, pressing him back and back past shop after shop, yelling at him angrily. Ponies stopped to stare. I'm under enough stress right now, and I don't need some vanilla-smelling, treat-making, sugar-slopping... Ching! There was a blood-curdling scream, and both ponies looked across the street. Bon Bon lay strewn unconscious on the sidewalk, pale as a sheet. Directly in front of her was the knife from the armchairs and knives shop. The knife had been metallic and quite real. The sign's gotta be real or false advertising. Sharpen it, too, the manager had said years ago. The massive utensil had buried itself deep into the sidewalk. Lyra stood there, eyes wide and pupils dilated. Then she screamed, too, throwing herself over Bon Bon and trying to shake her awake with tears in her lidded eyes. Bon Bon was passed out, but otherwise unharmed. Oh, my Celestia! Lickety-split gasped. That could have taken her head off! He pointed with a hoof. The wind blew it off the sign! Wow! Lyra suddenly waved at the pair from across the street. Thank you! She cried as tears leapt from her face because of the wind. If we hadn't stopped to stare at your fighting, Bon Bon would be... She lost her head entirely and flung herself upon her limp mare friend, weeping. Bon Bon would wake hours later with a tear-streaked pelt and tons of kisses upon her face. Much love-making would be had that night. Pinkamena stared with wide eyes. A death had been prevented. A sudden smile split her face. For some reason it terrified Lickety-split far more than her shouting and dark frowns. The pieces fell into place before her eyes. Something had arranged for Lickety to bother her today, since she'd not had access to all of her Pinky Sense evidence. He'd been the instrument of karma and a preventer of fate. She looked across the street as Lyra struggled to get the unconscious Bon Bon onto her back, still very upset. She turned around and was making her way for their apartment home. The wind was really picking up, uncomfortably so. Lickety looked into the sky with a grim expression. "Could be a tornado or something on the way," he said. "The weather Pegasi have been giving warnings for a few days now." Pinkamena wouldn't have heard any. She'd not been awake in a few weeks. Suddenly a brick pitched itself out of a nearby building and exploded into pieces at her hooves. She'd whinnied ferally, rearing up with a panicked expression. "Whoa!" Lickety said, for suddenly some pony had turned up the wind. Their manes flapped like flags. "Come on! We have to get inside!" He rudely grabbed Pinkamena by the shoulder, steering her down the street. They arrived at his ice cream parlor, and the stallion struggled to get the glass door shut. Bolting it, he looked out briefly. Every pony was running, panicking, taking shelter. "This way!" He took her further as the wind howled and shrieked outside, picking up anything that was not nailed down and making off with it. Bricks, tree limbs, dog houses, even things as large as pumpkins, right out of pony gardens. Pinkamena gave a shriek when a large stone exploded through a window, blasting its way into one of the ice cream freezers like a comet of death. Lickety pitched himself over her like a turtle shell, and he shimmied with her to his private residence in the back of the shop. "This way! This way!" he shouted over the aching groans the building was threatening them with. "The closet is aligned with the bathroom. It's safest." He opened it and stuffed Pinkamena inside, then crowded in with her while slamming it shut. They huffed and puffed in absolute darkness. The pink mare glared at blackness, listening to the howling storm outside. They flinched when another foreign object blasted into the room through a window and shattered itself upon Lickety's coffee table. It was by instinct that he grabbed her up, hunching over her protectively. She let him. If a pitchfork or something sharp came flying into the closet door, it would kill him first, and... oh, there was that scent again. Pinkamena's eyes went just a little bit soft when her muzzle was pressed into his mint-green mane. Vanilla. She shuddered just a little, and he stuttered quiet apologies for mare-handling her into such a tiny space. There was a long, tense silence while they listened to the storm pitch and rage outside. "Got any chips?" Pinkamena asked rather flatly. "What?" he asked to the darkness. Their noses were almost pressed together. "Got any chips? I'm craving salt," she told him. For some reason, this made Lickety burst into giggles. They shifted awkwardly, pressed together in the pipe-insulated closet. He apologized again and again, then finally shifted properly. It felt like coats all around them. Coats and boots and a few other odds and ends. "I wonder if I could... there it is." He reared up, and she almost got a very awkward face full of... He came down again, something in his teeth. It was hard to see in the darkness. There were some scraping sounds, and he struck a match. They were illuminated and stared at each other for a bit. "Gimme one." Pinkamena rudely took the box, shuffling a bit. "There." She struck one, lighting her sea salt breeze candle. The tiny closet was lit with a wavering flame. The storm crashed something against Lickety's roof, and they both flinched again. What was going on out there? A tornado? The pink mare reminded herself to growl at Rainbow Dash about the weather Pegasi going overboard. Now she was stuck in a closet under a powerful storm with a stupid stallion that smelled like vanilla, in the dark. Almost in the dark. He could have smelled worse. Lickety tried to give Pinkamena a little more room, but the space was quite cramped and they could not help but share some of the same space. There, by candlelight, they stared at each other for a long time. He smiled rather goofily at her, red in the cheeks. She knew that goofy look. She'd seen other stallions make it at their mare friends and very special some ponies. "Don't!" Pinkamena said rather sternly, looking to one side with a flap of her limp mane. "What?" he asked, perking his ears. "Look at me like that." She shifted a little. uncomfortably pressing her mane behind her ear. "Why not? You're beautiful." Just then, a 4x4 of wood blasted into the closet between them, kissing the stallion over the face and knocking him right out. The spray of wood chips made the mare cough. The bruise on his face was exquisite. Pinkamena stared, terrified into silence for a long moment, slack-jawed. That could have easily taken either of their heads off. Fate, it seemed, was not without a sense of humor. She checked him. He was alive, just knocked out. She found herself smiling just a little. Pushing the wooden bit out of the door and out to the other side, she pulled Lickety's head to her breast with both hooves. "Because my heart falls asleep at the end of the day, stupid stallion. Pinkie Pie is the one you love. She's the one you want," she said with a somber, angry frown. She pressed her muzzle into his mane while she stroked it gently. Cramped into the tiny space, there wasn't much else to do other than keep the candle from setting fire to his coats. Vanilla. Stupid, stupid stallion. When Lickety-split woke the next morning, he was one of the many ponies at a recovery tent in the middle of town. His head was bandaged, but Pinkamena was gone. Strangely, some pony had left a half-eaten bag of potato chips next to his bed.